Act. The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2289 under a structured rule and makes 5 amendments in order, 2 Democrat and 2 Republican, as well as 1 bipartisan amendment, allowing for a balanced debate on these important issues. H.R. 2289 is essential to the smooth functioning of the American economy and is long overdue for an enactment into law. This important legislation will reauthorize the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, also known as the CFTC, which had its statutory authority lapse in September of 2013. The House passed, with strong bipartisan support, a very similar version of this legislation on June 24th of last year. Unfortunately, the Senate failed to take up the House-passed bill despite its strong bipartisan support in the House, leading us to reconsider this legislation again today. After the financial crisis of 2008, almost everyone agreed that changes needed to be made to our financial services sector in order to protect our economy and prevent another crisis in the future. Like many of my colleagues, I have concerns with some of the reforms that were instituted in response to this financial calamity, because they have put overly burdensome restrictions on our business communities. However, it is important to note that this legislation keeps intact the overarching reforms made in Title VII of the Dodd-Frank Act. Every witness that appeared in front of the Agriculture Committee was supportive of the clearing, margining, and execution requirements that are the heart of Title VII. But, like every major comprehensive law, and this was very comprehensive, there are always unintended consequences that need to be addressed. And H.R. 2289 does just that. For example, the authors of Dodd-Frank would likely argue the law's main purpose is to reduce systemic risk to the economy. However, I don't think anyone would argue that farmers who are simply trying to lock in a good price for their corn or their wheat are a systemic risk to our economy, just as restaurant chains looking to make sure they have enough beef or pork or potatoes to sell to their patrons also do not pose a systemic risk. Utility companies seeking to ensure that they have enough power to meet the needs and demands of their customers did not cause the financial crisis. Unfortunately, though, the current law imposes rules that treat all of these entities as major risks to our economy and imposes overly burdensome capital and paperwork requirements on them. Mr. Speaker, critics may claim this bill undermines consumer protections. However, this could not be further from the truth. Title I of H.R. 2289 puts in place greater consumer protections, like requiring brokerage firms to notify investors before moving funds from one account to another in order to prevent abuses like those that occurred at MF Global prior to its bankruptcy. It would also require firms that become undercapitalized to immediately report to regulators and work with them to restore adequate capital and financial security. These Title I provisions are common sense reforms that will protect consumers. Title II would make reforms to the CFTC itself, such as strengthening the cost-benefit analysis the CFTC must perform when considering the impacts of its rules, and appointing a chief economist to assist with compiling and analyzing financial data. Critics may claim that requiring cost-benefit analyses will open up the CFTC to lawsuits, which would be costly. However, such critics also ignore the endless cycle of proposal and reproposals of rules that are rushed, poorly conceived, and unworkable. This work requires the CFTC to waste staff time and commission funds to redraft rules or to provide workarounds for impacted parties. This requirement merely gives the CFTC a standard for writing good rules the first time that will benefit our economy and the users. Title II would also require the CFTC to take steps to invest in IT to protect sensitive market data against cyber attacks. A very real issue given the recent breaches we've seen at the IRS and various national retailers. Most importantly, this section reauthorizes the CFTC until 2019, which has been operating without our authorization to spend money for a year and a half. Title III now gets to the heart of what I mentioned earlier, providing relief to the end users, or the farmers, the restaurants, the manufacturers, the utilities, and other entities who rely on a steady supply of commodities but have been caught up in the unintended consequences of Dodd-Frank's reforms. These users have a genuine need to use markets to hedge against bad weather, natural disasters, inflation, price shocks, and other unforeseen circumstances that could jeopardize their ability to serve their customers. These entities inherently want to avoid risk and thus shouldn't be subject to the same requirements as financial and investment entities. Mr. Speaker, Title III of H.R. 2289 makes significant reforms to aid these end users, such as preventing utility companies from being inappropriately classified as financial entities and being treated like banks under the law. It exempts end users who are not otherwise regulated by the CFTC from having to keep records of every email, phone call, fax, letter with regard to every trade, a huge record-keeping burden. It would prevent non-bank swap dealers from having to hold more capital than banks do, which would put them at an unfair disadvantage in the market. Additionally, this section would allow end users operating in rarely traded markets not to have to disclose trade data, which can be a serious disadvantage if they must publicly show all of their trading partners what they are buying and selling. Title III would also require the CFTC to determine if foreign swaps, the rules for foreign swaps, are equivalent to U.S. rules and create a workable system of substituted compliance for market participants whose activity across multiple jurisdictions. This would ensure that businesses which trade internationally do not have to comply with two sets of divergent rules. Mr. Speaker, the most important thing to remember about H.R. 2289 is that the farmer who grows the food that you eat for dinner did not cause the financial crisis. Neither did the people you buy your electricity from, or the people who provided the wood for your desk, or the metal used in your car. I do not know of any reason why we should continue to treat them as if they did, which is what the current law does, and which is what H.R. 2289 is seeking to correct. Mr. Speaker, this is a good, straightforward rule allowing for consideration of important legislation that will help grow our economy, and I support its adoption. I urge my colleagues to support the rule and the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse, for the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this rule and to the underlying legislation. Since my friends on the other side of the aisle assume the majority, they have made it their mission to undermine the Dodd-Frank Act and hamstring the ability of our regulators to put in place strong rules to prevent another financial crisis. And this legislation is no exception. H.R. 2289 reauthorizes the Commodity Futures Trading Commission through 2019 while making substantial changes to the CFTC's internal operations and rolling back key Dodd-Frank provisions intended to strengthen our financial regulatory framework. I have specific concerns with the new cost-benefit requirements imposed in Title II of the legislation. The CFTC already conducts cost-benefit analyses on its rulemakings, and this provision could significantly slow down the rulemaking process while also creating openings that will put the CFTC at the risk of increased litigation. Title II of H.R. 2289 also proposes several unnecessary changes to the Commission's internal operations that can make it more difficult to manage the agency. According to CFTC Chairman Massad, the provisions contained in Title II could weaken the Commission's ability to respond in a timely and effective manner. For example, if these measures were currently in place, it would have made it more difficult for the agency to positively respond over the past 10 months to concerns raised by market participants. Also included in this bill are substantial changes to rulemakings taking place at the Commission under the Dodd-Frank Act. I'm particularly concerned by the cross-border language contained in the bill, which will undercut the efforts already underway by the Commission to negotiate on an international system of safe and robust derivative rules that are necessary to apply to the global derivatives market. H.R. 2289 requires the CFTC to create a rule that will automatically allow U.S. banks and foreign banks conducting business in the U.S. to do so under the rules imposed by foreign jurisdictions, all of which are currently more lenient than our own. We've seen this kind of race to the bottom before, and we all know how it ends. Worse yet, Mr. Speaker, is that this legislation hamstrings an agency that is already woefully underfunded. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the CFTC will need 30 additional personnel annually to handle the increased workload imposed by both the new cost-benefit analysis requirements and the mandated cross-border rule contained in this legislation. Will my friends on the other side of the aisle provide the necessary funding increases to the CFTC to carry out these requirements? I doubt it. Dodd-Frank significantly expanded the CFTC's role in overseeing our financial markets, and they have already completed over 80% of their required rulemakings, the best rate of any financial regulator. They have done so despite the fact that Congress has not done its part to provide the agency with the resources it needs to police these incredibly complex markets, populated by highly sophisticated and extremely powerful entities. Remember AIG, the insurer brought down by derivatives trades that the CFTC is now policing? If that memory is fuzzy, I'm sure you remember the funds we provided to bail AIG out that came to a total of $67.8 billion. That would be enough to fund the CFTC at the level requested in the President's budget for over 200 years. The Commission needs a reauthorization, but it certainly doesn't need one saddled with changes that will hamstring its internal operations, prolong its rulemaking through an inflexible cost-benefit analysis requirement that opens it to litigation risk, and force it to allow a race to the bottom on international rules governing a global market. So I ask my colleagues to join me in opposing the rule and the underlying legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I see my colleague, the chairman of the committee, has come. Before I yield the floor to him, I'd just like to make one comment in response to my colleague from Massachusetts. Considering underfunding of CFTC, you know, in the last 5 years, through the reductions of federal spending, the efforts that have been going on, I think anyone would be hard-pressed to find another agency that has received an almost 50% increase in its budget over that period of time. Just to point out that certainly they have received a lot of new responsibilities under Dodd-Frank, but also a large increase in their available resources. Mr. Speaker, I would like at this point to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Mr. Conaway.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the rule to provide for the consideration of H.R. 2289, the Commodity End User Relief Act. I want to start by thanking Chairman Sessions and the entire Rules Committee for their time and work in preparing this rule. Yesterday's hearing was spirited but fair, and they've produced a rule that reflects the tremendous work the Ag Committee has put into this issue. Over the past few years, the Ag Committee has heard from dozens of witnesses at over 10 hearings. These witnesses, many of which are market participants, struggling to comply with the needlessly burdensome rules and ambiguous portions of the underlying statute, have been consistent in their call to action. To address their concerns, H.R. 2289 makes targeted reforms that fall into 3 broad categories: customer protection, commission reforms, and end-user relief. Title I of the bill protects customers and margin funds they deposit in their FCMs by codifying critical changes made in the wake of the collapse of the bankruptcy of MF Global and Peregrine Falcon. Title II makes meaningful reforms to the operation of the Commission to improve the agency's deliberative process. In doing so, it also requires the Commission to conduct more robust cost-benefit analysis to help get future rulemakings right the first time and avoid the endless cycle of reproposing and delaying unworkable rules. While the CFTC is already required to consider costs and benefits of the rules it proposes, this rule attempts to legitimize that practice, a practice that had been called into question. The current practice, been called into question by the Commission's own Inspector General, who reported the agency seemed to view the process as more of a legal one than an economic one. Finally, Title III of the bill fixes real problems faced by end users who rely on derivatives markets to manage their risks. When it is more costly for those who need these markets to use them, it discourages them from the It discourages the exact kind of prudent risk management activities Congress intended to protect with the end user exemption in Dodd-Frank. Accordingly, the bill provides relief to agricultural and commercial market participants struggling to comply with the overreaching and costly record-keeping requirements. It allows utility companies to continue using contracts that allow for a change in the volume of the commodity delivered without the worry of needlessly complying with the swaps regulations. H.R. 2289 will preserve end-user ability to hedge against anticipated business risk by providing a more workable definition of bona fide hedging. And the bill also addresses the serious concerns regarding the lack of harmony and clarity in global derivatives regulation by requiring the CFTC to publish a rule addressing how the U.S. swaps requirements apply to transactions occurring outside the United States and with non-U.S. persons. To be clear, 2289 makes these meaningful improvements for market participants without undermining the basic goals of Title VII of Dodd-Frank, the Holy Grail, to bring clearing, reporting, and electronic execution requirements to swaps transactions. In closing, I'd like to thank the members of the Ag Committee who have worked hard, including Mr. Newhouse, to advance this important legislation. I'm especially appreciative of Mr. Lucas, who worked on reauthorization last year, which was our starting point for this year, as well as some of our newest members. I'd also particularly thanks to Mr. Austin Scott and Mr. David Scott, the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee, respectively, that oversees the CFTC. Both of these gentlemen have joined me as original sponsors and have held a series of hearings on reauthorization. Another 30 seconds.
I yield an additional 30 seconds, Mr. Speaker.
They did outstanding work helming a new subcommittee focused on these issues, and I look forward to their diligent oversight work throughout the rest of the Congress. Similar to the CFTC reauthorization bill passed by the House with overwhelming bipartisan support last year, the Commodity End User Relief Act is comprised of narrowly targeted changes to the CEA. The committee has again put together a bill that earned the bipartisan support of our members because we brought the right relief to the right people. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge the adoption of the rule and support for the underlying act. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I just want to point out to my colleague from Washington State, with regard to the funding of the CFTC, that the agency has never received the funding that that is requested, and that's just a fact. And here we are imposing new requirements, new mandates. CBO, as I mentioned in my opening, estimates that the CFTC will need an additional 30 personnel to annually to handle the increased workload imposed by the new cost-benefit analysis requirements of the mandated cross-border rule contained in the provisions in this bill. So we're asking an agency that has never been properly funded to even do more and not provide it with the proper funding. I don't think that's a smart way to move forward when it comes to, an issue so important. I also want to point out to my colleagues that they should have received a letter from the Consumer Federation of America strongly opposing this bill. Let me just read you the first paragraph. It says, we're writing on behalf of the Consumer Federation of America to ask you to oppose H.R. 2289, which the House is expected to vote on this month. This legislation would hamstring the Commodity Futures Trading Commission from effectively overseeing and regulating commodities and derivatives markets, leaving consumers exposed to fraud, manipulation, and abusive practices, and putting the safety and stability of the U.S. financial system at risk. The The language in this bill largely mirrors the language offered in last year's CFTC reauthorization bill, which the Obama administration strongly opposed because it undermined the efficient functioning of the CFTC and offered no solution to address the persistent inadequacy of the agency's funding. We urge you to resist this relentless attack on the CFTC by voting against this misguided and harmful legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert this in the record.
Without objection.
And I would urge my colleagues who are observing this debate that each one of them received a copy of this letter from the Consumer Federation of America strongly opposing this bill. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, the ranking member of the Agriculture Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit, Mr. Scott.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me say that, as the gentleman just mentioned, I do serve as the chairman of the Jurisdictional Committee on Commodities and Futures and Trading that the CFTC comes under. I say that only to say that I've been in the vineyards on this issue and have been struggling with it and working on it over many, many years. The whole derivatives and the commodities and futures markets has changed dramatically. We've had a downfall in our economy because of a lot of activity that was wrong going on Wall Street and our financial community, out of which we are now emerging. But, Mr. Speaker, what is urgent here is the fact that we cannot delay any longer. It's very important for people to understand that no legislation is perfect. I'm the first one to say that. This is a glass that looks to be half empty or maybe half full. I look at it as half full. And I look at it as an urgent issue. We have got to get end user relief. That is the major component of this reauthorization for the CFTC. Because it is the end users, our manufacturers, our farmers, those who produce the products, those who had nothing to do with the downfall of Wall Street. Why should they be consistently held to the same intrinsic regulations and rules that our financial institutions have? We've got to have those financial institutions under strong regulation, but it's important that we put the same sort of cost-benefit analysis into this agency that the Obama administration has in every one of their executive agencies. And furthermore, it's not a mandate, it is an assessment. It is saying to assess the efficiencies, make sure we do it. And it does not put a requirement that any decision on the cost-benefit analysis outweighs one another as a requirement for them to make a decision. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must pass this bill, and we need to do it quickly, because in Section 300 of this bill, I think it's Section 323, we address a crucial issue. The European Union is eating our lunch. All across the world, we're losing our stature as the leading financial industry and system in the world. That affects every ounce of our security. We are number one in the world, and it's about time we stand up and assure that by making sure that we address this the European Union's harsh discrimination against our financial institutions abroad. This is particularly true when it comes to our clearinghouses, the standards that they're using. And now, Mr. Speaker, yes, we are dealing with 8 foreign countries, but they must have similar regimes, what we call equivalency. Now, why is that important, Mr. Speaker? It's important because it is the CFTC that must determine if another nation, one of the 8 top foreign nations, has an equivalency that...
Gentleman, additional 1 minute.
Oh, well, thank you.
The gentleman is recognized.
To make sure that if that nation has an equivalency of a strong regulatory regime as the United States, then certainly we can do business under their regime. But as long as we don't pass this legislation, the CFTC doesn't have that. And finally, on all the cross-border situations, we need a definition of what a U.S. person is. And we need to give some backbone to our CFTC commission to say, look, why should the United States have to treat a foreign entity in a manner and with the respect that that foreign nation does not treat our industry? Mr. Speaker, this country, the United States, is losing a tremendous amount of our prestige and our leadership on the world stage. And nowhere is that being pronounced more than in our financial system. Because for 3 years, we have had this laid on the table. So I urge a positive vote for this rule, and I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for yielding me the time. Thank you.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and just like to say thank the gentleman from Georgia for his many years of hard work on this very complicated issue. As you can see, he understands it well and understands the importance of passing this reauthorization legislation, and I just want to thank him for his comments and hard work. Next, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the esteemed gentleman from Oklahoma, the former chairman of the Ag Committee, Mr. Frank Lucas.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of the underlying bill, H.R. 2289, the Commodity End Users Relief Act. This bipartisan bill is a result of a series of hearings that the Agriculture Committee heard from stakeholders that do business with the CFTC, as well as every CFTC commissioner. As chairman of the committee last year, I began the process of CFTC reauthorization, which resulted in the House-passed bipartisan bill. And I laud our committee chairman, Conaway, for his efforts in tackling this same subject and coming to the full House with another bipartisan CFTC reauthorization that passed the committee by a voice vote. A chief selling point of this bill is its commitment to good governance reforms at the CFTC to increase transparency and efficiency. First, the bill closely follows an executive order by President Obama to improve the cost-benefit analysis performed by the Commission prior to promulgating rules. In addition, the bill would improve this oversight of commissioners over activities which are outside the normal rulemaking process that still impact many futures market participants. Many of these activities, such as policy statements, guidance, and interpretation rules released by CFTC, would also be subject to public comment under the provisions of the bill when they have the force of law. Furthermore, H.R. 2289 establishes an Office of Chief Economist at the CFTC to provide objective economic data and analysis. The committee also heard from end users during this process and included several provisions to provide relief to those end users, such as a more workable definition of bona fide hedging and relief from burdensome record-keeping rules for many businesses. The CFTC has gone unauthorized since 2013, and it's time many CFTC activities were reformed by Congress. This rule will make possible the underlying bill that will improve the CFTC in many important ways. I urge all of my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield myself such time as I may consume. I just want to be clear on one thing. Yes, this is an authorization bill. It is not an appropriations bill. But the issue of funding for the CFTC is relevant in the discussion of this authorization bill because we're essentially proposing that we give additional responsibilities or require additional actions from the CFTC with no guarantee that we're going to provide the resources for them to do their job. We haven't provided them the adequate resources to do what they've been expected to do from the very beginning. I also want to say that most end user relief in this bill is not objectionable, but the CFTC is already addressing them through rulemaking. A better way to address these concerns than in statute would be more flexibility for them to do rulemaking which can be adjusted. In addition to end-user provisions, this bill also contains all the problems that we've already identified with regard to cost-benefit and cross-border. And so, I mean, there are some significant issues here. The Del Bene amendment was mentioned earlier. I want to make it clear that that does not prevent litigation. It just restates the standard of review from Administrative Procedure Act, abuse of discretion. And I will also point out to my colleagues that the cost-benefit analysis is mandated. It is mandated by Section 202. So again, I would feel better about all of this if we address the funding shortfall in the CFTC. We're not doing that, and I don't expect that this majority is going to work with us on that. I also want to ask for unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to insert on the record a letter that was sent to all members of the House from the Americans for Financial Reform, strongly opposing H.R. 2289. And let me just read you the opening paragraph. On behalf of Americans for Financial Reform, we are writing to express our opposition to H.R. 2289. This legislation would have a severe and negative impact on the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and its ability to police commodity and derivatives markets. The new restrictions it places on the CFTC would require additional years of bureaucratic red tape prior to agency action. It would enable numerous industry lawsuits against the agency and would create inappropriate statutory restrictions on the agency's ability to properly oversee markets crucial to the financial system. Again, I'd urge all my colleagues to look in their mail for the letter for the Americans for Financial Reform, strongly opposed to this, and I reserve my time.
Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the good gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of this resolution, the underlying legislation, House Resolution 2289, the Commodity End User Relief Act. And as chairman of the Agriculture Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit, I want to thank our chairman, Mr. Conaway, for his strong leadership and for making this reauthorization process a productive one through the full Ag Committee. I also want to thank my colleague from Georgia and the ranking member of the Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit Subcommittee, Mr. David Scott. He's been a tremendous partner throughout this effort and certainly continue to work well together, and I thank you for that. Derivatives markets exist to meet the risk management needs of farmers, ranchers, utilities, manufacturers, and other end users. To be clear, these hedging activities directly benefit the American citizen by helping consumer costs low and reducing the risk of manufacturing in the United States. The ability of producers and end users to use the derivatives markets to hedge risk has a direct impact on the cost of living in my district, Georgia's 8th Congressional District, and every other district around the country. It's essential that we have strong markets that our farmers, ranchers, and end users can utilize to meet their needs effectively. Earlier this year, our subcommittee held 3 very productive hearings that built upon the work done in the past 2 Congresses on this reauthorization effort. In many hours of testimony, we heard diverse perspectives from end users, market participants, and regulators that were instrumental in drafting this legislation. Their testimony included outlooks on the unintentional impacts that the market reforms enacted following the 2008 financial crisis are having on the end user community. Despite congressional attempts to exempt end users from some of the more costly and cumbersome mandates, end users continue to face unnecessary regulatory burdens and uncertainty. With this legislation, we have the opportunity to erase that. House Resolution 2289, the Commodity End User Relief Act, seeks to clarify congressional intent, minimize regulatory burdens, and most importantly, preserve the ability for these necessary risk management markets to serve those who need them. I believe we met these objectives of ensuring that our regulatory framework protects the integrity of our markets while not limiting the ability of end users to access these tools to conduct their business. I'm proud to support both this resolution and the underlying legislation, Mr. Speaker, and I urge my colleagues to join me in so doing. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
The
The gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is
Speaker,
recognized.
Can I inquire from the gentleman from Washington how many additional speakers he has on his side?
No additional speakers, Mr. McGovern.
Well, then I'll just close for our side. Mr. Speaker, I want to call to the attention of my colleagues the statement of administration policy on H.R. 2289 and just read a little bit of it so that my colleagues understand how strongly the administration is opposed to this. The administration strongly opposes the passage of H.R. 2289 because it undermines the efficient functioning of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission by imposing a number of organizational and procedural changes that would undercut efforts taken by the CFTC over the last year to address end-user concerns. H.R. 2289 also offers no solution to address the persistent inadequacy of the agency's funding. The CFTC is one of only 2 federal financial regulators funded through annual discretionary appropriations, and the funding that Congress has provided for it over the past 5 years has failed to keep pace with the increasing complexity of the nation's financial markets. The changes proposed in H.R. 2289 would hinder the ability of the CFTC to operate effectively, thereby threatening the financial security of the middle class by encouraging the same kind of risky, irresponsible behavior that led to the Great Recession. The statement concludes, Mr. Speaker, by saying if the President were presented with H.R. 2289, his senior advisors would recommend that he veto the bill. I think that basically says it all. I think while I respect the intentions of my colleagues who drafted this bill, I think it is a deeply flawed bill, and it creates hurdles for the CFTC that will not be fully funded and will cause all kinds of problems. And I think we ought to make sure that the CFTC can do its job. I don't want a repeat of the financial crisis that resulted in the Great Recession. And I think the American people don't want a repeat of that. And I get very worried when I see this Congress, chipping away at Dodd-Frank and the provisions of Dodd-Frank that get us back to what got us into this mess to begin with. I think we can do a lot better. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the rule and vote no on the underlying bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. And let me just say I appreciate the good discussion here today over the past hour. People on both sides of the aisle making very good comments, very good points. As it relates to the last comment from Mr. McGovern to talk about chipping away at Dodd-Frank, everything we do around here is fine-tuning, is improving what has been passed in past Congresses. It has been legislation, laws on the books that needs improvement, and I see that as what we're doing here today. So I appreciate very much the comments, and although we may have some differences, I believe that this rule and the underlying bill are very strong measures that are important to the future of our country. This rule provides for ample debate on the floor, the opportunity to debate and vote on the bill, and numerous amendments, which I would note are divided evenly between Democrat and Republican members of this chamber. It reflects the balanced deliberation that this rule will provide. This rule will provide for a smooth and deliberative process for sending this bill over to the Senate for their consideration. H.R. 2289 is a solid and substantial measure that will address several critical issues that the CFTC and end users are facing. Mr. Speaker, no one wants to see the complete deregulation of our financial services industry and our commodities and derivative markets, and I appreciate the comments from the gentleman from Massachusetts. However, it's critical that the regulations put in place are appropriate for our economy and as well as for the users. These rules have to provide safeguards and prevent systemic risk, but cannot catch our entire economy in a one-size-fits-all regulation. As we've discussed here today, the current rules place enormous paperwork and financial burdens on small businesses, and that cannot go unstated. Our small businesses, our ranchers, our utilities, and our manufacturers all face these financial burdens. They They take these small risk adverse entities and place them under the same regulatory scheme as large financial institutions and hedge funds. H.R. 2289 will differentiate and exempt the end users who are not a cause of systemic risk and should not have been lumped into these rules in the first place. The underlying bill would also make much-needed reforms in the CFTC to strengthen their rulemaking process and add common-sense consumer protections. Overall, this is a strong rule that provides for consideration of this important legislation. I urge my colleagues to support House Resolution 288 and the underlying bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote. Yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by an electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.